Welcome to the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. I'm joined today by Professor Jane Green, who is from Nuffield College, University of Oxford, and the President of the British Polling Council. Welcome, Jane. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Holly. It's lovely to see you.
I've replaced Cameron and Kieran with you today, so hoping to get some more of an expert opinion from someone outside or kind of loosely outside of the polling industry, I guess. And It's probably a good place to start to just think about the state of the race, where we are in the campaign. And we've got some new Ipsos numbers out in the next couple of days showing not much change, to be honest, in headline vote intention. Labour still ahead by about 20 points. Rishi Sunak having the worst favourability ratings that he has consistently had, which we continue to say every month, and also only 16% of the public telling us that they think the Conservative Party are having a good campaign. What do you make of all of that, Jane?
Yeah, it's pretty low, isn't it? I mean, our own British election study data shows very low confidence in either of the parties to handle the core issues as well. I'm sure your data says exactly the same thing. I was really struck by it just looking at it today, that the majority of people think that neither party can handle each of the kind of 5 top issues very well. So this is all a consistent story, isn't it? That we're seeing low confidence in the government, but also not a great deal more confidence in the Labour Party. Nevertheless, we have this 20-point lead. Obviously, there has been a little bit of change. So even though the lead has remained pretty consistent, there's a discernible increase now in Reform UK's share, the trend across pollsters, if not the level of the Reform UK share. Same obviously true for the Labour lead, that, you know, that the range in what that Labour lead looks like across pollsters is still really big. But nevertheless, it looks like both of the two largest parties are seeing a little bit of a decline in their support during this campaign, with the possibility of the Liberal Democrats making some gains as well. So it feels a little bit like 2015, where, you know, voters were looking at the two major parties and deciding that they didn't really like either of them enough, but still with a campaign that hasn't really made a massive difference, like perhaps in contrast to 2017, where, you know, one party's kind of disastrous campaign was, very clearly saw a lead for the Labour Party. So we're not seeing that. So it's really interesting. Obviously, Nigel Farage's entry back into frontline UK politics very plausibly and possibly and almost certainly really made a big impact on the Conservatives. And, it must be a pretty torrid time to see those kind of poll numbers worsening for the Conservatives over this campaign.
Yeah, as you said, we've not seen much narrowing in the polls in terms of the two main parties that we kind of potentially expected to see or have seen in previous election cycles. But interesting, the numbers of those smaller parties for many pollsters, including ourselves, have been creeping up over the past couple of weeks. And Reform in particular, given our first political monitor was before Farage entered the fray, I think this month we're probably likely to see something a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, we know, I mean, this is, what's so fascinating, isn't it, about the major sort of shifts that have taken place over elections recently, is we know 2017 and 2019 saw a very different electoral picture. And that you have to understand that in order to understand what's going on now, as you know. So, understanding the fact that almost all of the Conservative vote was comprised of leavers and people who like Boris Johnson and who like Brexit and also who like Nigel Farage, you have to understand that those were the voters the Conservatives had in 2019. So if they're going to lose any support, they're going to be predominantly losing support in that direction, which is why obviously the entry of Nigel Farage could have such an important impact. So all of the Conservative hopes, it seems, of kind of squeezing the Reform vote and bringing back undecided voters seem to not be working. And so there's going to be recriminations in the Conservative Party over the calling of the election, I would imagine, over those kind of, the inability of the campaign to have really succeeded in doing those things, even absent Nigel Farage's return. So, another fascinating election campaign. And there's always what I love about what I love about following British politics, and I love about polling and research, is that and covering elections too, is there's never an election that's entirely predictable. And I love the fact. I love the fact, but for me, it's fascinating, not because it's just data, but because it's telling us about people. It's telling us about real people's lives and how they're sort of making a verdict on the current political status quo. And I think it's a brilliant insight into the country. And obviously we get the proper verdict on July the 4th and the night of the 4th going into the 5th.
Not long to go until then. I think something you said then is really fascinating that struck me during this particular election campaign is those undecided voters. And one of our polls a couple of weeks ago, I think, had 45% of the public telling us they still might change their mind. And that was kind of 2 weeks out from the general election. So potential for a fair amount of volatility. And I saw a great piece in the Financial Times today about Labour sources kind of redirecting their kind of ground teams away from Liberal Democrat target seats in the southwest. So there are kind of these underlying things at play with the smaller parties. I think tactical voting could potentially, I mean, anecdotally through our qualitative research, we've got people telling us that they're going to do it. They're telling us how they're going to do it. What sort of a role do you think that tactical voting has the potential to play in this election?
Yeah, so I'm starting to think a bit differently about this, actually. So I think my kind of starting point for thinking about tactical voting in this election was that all of the factors that might increase tactical voting were there. I very, very hostile feelings towards the incumbent. And so the motivation to vote for whoever will get the Tories out. I know people have asked questions, boundary changes, it's a little bit more complicated. It's like, yeah, that's a little bit more complicated, but I don't think that changes the fundamental story. But I still think that the problem with this kind of election is that you're sort of talking about things that will matter. They will matter. They're not unimportant. They're not marginal things. They're important things. But the massive story will be the tide, this big tidal wave of support going to the Labour Party. And frankly, that could actually perhaps weaken some of that tactical voting. So you could be in a situation where you're in a Conservative Liberal Democrat marginal, and the thing to do would ordinarily be to vote for the Labour Party if you wanted to Lib Dem and if you wanted to stop a Conservative. But actually, Labour just might do really quite well anyway, because enough people will just feel like, well, actually, isn't this contest between the Conservatives and the Labour Party? Because obviously not everyone's paying close attention to the tactical race. And to do that, you have to look at past election results. You have to sort of understand the makeup of your constituency. The constituencies have changed, but it's also that the narrative seems so strong that the Labour Party is heading for a big majority and that the contest is primarily between those parties. So I sort of feel like the tide moving to Labour so strongly might actually potentially at least sort of overwhelm the impact of some of that tactical voting. But we'll wait and see. I mean, I could be completely wrong.
And do you think kind of the flip side of that, given there's a lot of talk about Labour winning, and I didn't want to say the supermajority word because I don't particularly believe in it, but they might win easily or they might win comfortably, for example. Do you think that could potentially have an impact on kind of turnout, or voters maybe thinking, well, it's a done deal, I'm not going to turn out, or I'm not going to vote in my constituency this time?
Yeah, absolutely. And close races obviously increase turnout. In general terms, historically, there's evidence for that. So inevitable outcomes or foregone conclusion kinds of elections do tend to depress turnout. And also parties that pretty much look pretty much the same, ideologically speaking. Now, obviously, the sort of, I guess, the caveat or the other way of thinking about this election, though, is that it might actually just be sort of apathy, and that we talked about at the beginning of not really having a lot of confidence or trust in either party, so not really thinking either party is a good solution to the problems that Britain faces. Or a lot of people angry enough to actually be motivated to actually go and do something about it. So, who knows? I think the important... So the level of turnout can go up and down in an individual election and not make a difference to the outcome. What matters, of course, is the differential turnout between if it impacts one party more than the other. And because age has been such an important dominant factor in explaining people's vote choice, the relationship of age to turnout is crucial. So older voters still more likely to vote for the Conservatives, younger, in fact, not even say younger, just not retirement
under 70
voters more likely, working age population more likely to vote for the Labour Party. But that, that's still having a gradient, that's still having a relationship as the younger you go. So that can be really important if age is again a factor on predicting turnout. So Labour could struggle a bit amongst younger voters who are saying they're going to vote for them but don't. Equally, Conservative voters could struggle. Conservatives could struggle if some of their older voters are undecided and don't indeed turn out to vote. So that could be a big problem. And of course, electoral registration is the first time we're seeing that going to be having an impact in a general election. So it's going to impact, it's going to be relevant to the kinds of people that don't follow politics as closely and therefore might not have, received all the information and got themselves organised in time. So, yeah, so I think turnout could be important this time round, but it's incredibly difficult to know how. We're only going to know that after the fact and after, really high quality random probability surveys that really reach through to the general population and are able to get enough people that don't vote in elections into their samples.
On the topic of high quality surveys, there have been a lot of them, not just from ourselves, many from ourselves, but from across the piece. And with your hat on as the president of the British Polling Council, you will have had the same questions as many of us in the industry have been having over the past few weeks. It is, are there too many polls, or why are there so many polls coming out currently? And I saw that you did a great explainer on this recently, and probably a better one than I attempted to do on the news last week. But what would you say to that sort of critique that we're seeing as an industry?
I think there's been some really fascinating aspects of the role of polls in this particular election. I don't think it's all to do with the number. So I think that's been a factor, absolutely. And we've seen more pollsters join the polling industry. Polling has become cheaper to do. There are many more pollsters than many more members of the British Polling Council. So we're in a different kind of world where there's lots of pollsters. But it has really struck me how important or I can't call them prediction models, but the MRP models, these models that take large samples and estimate the outcomes in constituencies, how important the role they've been playing in the sort of discussion around this election. That I think has been relatively amplified. I mean, they're not new in this particular election, but it has had there maybe have been more of them. They're particularly shocking for the Conservative Party, so they make great headlines this time round in particular. And, I think there are some challenges there in terms of, what are election campaigns really about? Are they about the horse race, or are they about the underlying substantive issues that voters want to know about? And I think it has felt like the balance has been a bit out of kilter this time round.
Yeah, and I think we did our first MRP this time, so we threw our hat into the ring, and I think you're right in saying, well, potentially because the headline vote intention for a lot of pollsters hasn't changed throughout the course of the campaign. A lot of people see MRPs as maybe giving that a bit more kind of granularity, the translation into seats, being able to actually look at specific areas and regions and demographics and like people, like core people who may lose their seats. But I think the range of them has been kind of the scale of the victory and margin of victory on some of them has been there's been a wide range, shall we say.
And they're complicated to explain, and they're complicated for people to understand. And so I think if people like ourselves, if it takes us a few minutes to explain how MRPs are done and what are the different factors that are driving the different kinds of outcomes that different models, we're not going to expect any normal person to be bothered to pay their attention to that kind of level of detail. So that's an issue, I think. Whereas I think people broadly have understood polling is done in samples, and they're trying to get kind of estimates of people's vote intention and so on. That people understand surveys, but I don't think they can understand multi-level post-stratification models. So I think that's a particular challenge actually. And the big thing that's obviously affecting the estimations of these MRP models is the relationship of votes to geography. Now, if for some reason, and I don't know what that would be, but if for some reason those are significantly misjudging something important, just say it is. I can't imagine what that is, but maybe after the fact I would. Then the polling industry is going to come under a really interesting new level of scrutiny, which will ultimately be helpful. These things generally are. But it worries me a little bit that expectations have been raised so significantly that Labour on course for such a large majority, potentially, and the Conservatives for, electoral wipeout almost, that anything that departs from that is now going to be judged against models. And against polls, which are difficult to do. So and the potential. There's the potential then to on election night to say, well, the polls got it wrong, and then the polls might have been bang on, or at least somebody's poll might have been bang on, but it's taking what you do when you take the polls and translate them into seat estimations that would have been wrong. So we're going to have to be really, really careful about that, because we don't get the kind of vote shares until a bit later, and we're not going to really understand how accurate the actual poll surveys themselves have been until we get those vote shares.
Yeah, we've all got our fingers and toes crossed at Ipsos and everywhere else that we're as bang on as we were last time. But as you said, there's a lot of different numbers floating around. So there will be people who are right, there will be people who are wrong, and there'll be some scrutiny afterwards as well.
I think what Ipsos has done well, and it's not just Ipsos that have done this well, but has said there are so many constituencies, it was 117 that are just so close to call that we don't want to call them, that they could go either way. And I think that's helpful. Having kind of estimations, having kind of a language around, and here's the uncertainty, here's this range. And that's, again, statistically speaking, it's a very hard thing to explain to a layperson, but I think it's really important to say something like that. There are 117 seats that we think are so close that they could go either way. Therefore, a 115 number could actually be very different. So, so there's some good practice around there, I think, as well.
Yeah. Final question then, Jane. Given we'll be hard at work, well, I personally won't, but some of the team will be hard at work on the exit poll in the run-up to the actual election. It's my first election at Ipsos, so I'm not sure exactly what they'll have me hold up doing during election night, but you yourself will be in a TV studio having to have memorised every number that's ever happened during the election campaign, be on top of the name of every constituency, every MP, every candidate. What does it look like for you on the night?
It's not nearly that terrifying, actually, because if it were, I'd just be in my office just cramming. No, it's. I think our job as academics is to provide accessible explanation. I don't personally think that I'm going to add a ton of value by saying, well, in 1992, this seat was in it. But what I can say is there's a pattern here that tells us this. It tells us how people are behaving. And this fits a trend, it fits a pattern. As with anything we do as social scientists, we're not always, we're looking at the signal rather than the noise with all of the kind of analysis of variation, right? So no, I am not the person who has a photographic memory of, how that constituency voted in the past. But I can understand what kinds of constituencies we're talking about. Right? So if I look at constituency, I'm like, okay, right. I know this is the kind of place that I think is behaving like X, and here's why. So what I have done, and I will of course be, doing lots of preparation between now and next Thursday. Thank goodness there's still some more time. But the thing that I did was I mapped out in my head. I spent quite a decent amount of time thinking about how would I explain a hung parliament all the way through to how would I explain a huge majority, one of the MRP estimations, and what are the factors. And so we've got it down and this is what I love about working with brilliant, clever telly people. So my big unwieldy academic document that said, you could show this graph, you could show this graph, and it would be interesting to compare Liberal Democrat gains in these areas and these areas. And I think it could be explained because the Liberal Democrats aren't doing such a good job here. They got it down to 4 key things. And so I'm planning an explanatory thing live on election night that essentially says these are the 4 key things that would take Labour either from here to here, and we're going to be looking to see how well they've done across those 4 areas. Boom. So that's the power of telly, and it's making academics be much more succinct.
And I'm not going to ask you for sneak previews because that would be spoiling the fun, and everyone should instead tune in and watch Jane on election night on the ITV coverage, and keep an eye out as well for our political monitor, our final campaign tracker, and all of the rest of the polling that we'll be furiously doing over the next couple of weeks. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Jane, for joining us. Fascinating discussion as always, and good luck with not your cramming, but your memorising of your 4 key points so that you can hit them on election night live on telly.
Yeah, I do have to get the words right and the right sequence and the right graphics and the right graph. So yeah, I'll be practicing that probably about 30 times. But thank you very much for having me, Holly. It's lovely to talk to you as always.
Thanks, Jane.